The richest man in the city had read thousands of numbers in his life. But that night, two small pieces of paper made his hands stop shaking. Damian Whitmore never expected a late-night bus ride to reveal the truth his own company had hidden from him. The last bus through downtown Chicago moved quietly beneath the glow of streetlights, carrying tired workers, students, and people who had nowhere else to be. Near the back window, a woman slept with her head resting against the glass, one hand wrapped tightly around two worn pay stubs, as if letting go of them would make everything disappear. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and she had spent the last 12 hours trying to hold her life together. At 30 years old, she had learned how to work through exhaustion, how to smile when her bank account was almost empty, and how to tell her 7-year-old son Jordan that everything would be okay even when she was not sure it would be. Her old black jacket was folded beneath her arm. Her grocery list was still visible on her phone screen. Milk, cereal, Jordan's medicine. 3 things that mattered more than anything else. Across the aisle, Damian Whitmore sat alone. The billionaire CEO of Whitmore Technologies was used to private cars, quiet offices, and people who carefully chose every word around him. But tonight, after another endless board meeting, he had made a decision he rarely made. He wanted to see the city without tinted windows between him and the world. He wanted to remember what ordinary life looked like. He almost missed the woman sleeping near the back of the bus. Almost. Until the bus turned sharply and the papers in her hand slipped slightly into the light from the window. Damian looked down without meaning to. One pay stub showed a familiar company name, Whitmore Technologies. His company. His eyes narrowed. The employee name was Aaliyah Carter. The second paper looked almost identical, but the numbers were different. The hours were different. The income was different. For a moment, he assumed it was a mistake. Numbers were his world. Mistakes were rare. But the longer he looked, the more something felt wrong. The woman beside him moved slightly, still asleep. She looked exhausted, but there was something peaceful in the way she protected those papers. Not greed. Not ambition. Something else. Responsibility. Damian looked away, but the question stayed with him. Why did one person have 2 different versions of her own paycheck? When the bus reached the next stop, Aaliyah suddenly woke up. Her eyes widened as she realized how late it was. She quickly grabbed her bag, checked her phone, and rushed toward the exit. The papers almost fell again. Damian reached out and caught them before they touched the floor. "You dropped these," he said quietly. Aaliyah turned around, surprised. "Thank you," she whispered, taking them back carefully. Her eyes briefly met his, and Damian noticed something he had not expected. She was tired, but she was not defeated. "Long day?" he asked. Aaliyah gave a small smile. "Every day is long when you are trying to be everything for everyone." Then the bus doors opened, and she stepped into the cold Chicago night. Damian watched her disappear into the crowd. He looked down at the company logo printed on the corner of the pay stub, still visible in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a question more powerful than any business challenge he had faced. How could the CEO of a company know billions of dollars in profits, but know nothing about the people who earned them? He looked at the empty bus seat where Aaliyah had been sitting. Then he looked again at the numbers that did not make sense. And somewhere between the final bus stop and the silent streets of Chicago, Damian Whitmore realized the biggest secret inside his company was not hidden in a boardroom. It was sitting quietly in the hands of a woman everyone had learned to ignore. The morning after the last bus ride, Damian Whitmore arrived at Whitmore Technologies before sunrise. The city outside his glass office was still quiet, but his mind was already filled with the same image from the night before. A tired woman holding 2 pay stubs. A name he recognized. A number that did not belong. Damian had built his company by trusting numbers. Numbers told stories without emotion. They revealed growth, losses, risks, and opportunities. But for the first time in years, he wondered if numbers could also hide the truth. He placed the 2 documents on his desk and studied them again. Aaliyah Carter. Customer Support Division. Employee status active. The first paycheck showed her official salary. The second showed a different payment history, one that included additional hours and deductions that were never reflected in her actual income. It was not just a mistake. It was a pattern. Damian picked up the phone and called Marcus Bell, the head of human resources. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a tablet and a cautious expression. "You look like you found something serious," Marcus said. Damian turned the screen toward him. Tell me why an employee in our company has two different payroll records. Marcus looked at the documents. For a moment, his confidence disappeared. I will need to investigate. Damien watched his reaction carefully. You already know something. Marcus looked away. I know there have been payroll complaints in some departments. But every review showed the company was following policy. That answer bothered Damien more than an admission would have. Following policy had always been his excuse for not looking deeper. He had spent years believing that if reports were clean, then the company was healthy. But now he wondered how many people had struggled quietly while the numbers looked perfect. Later that morning, Damien visited the customer support department without announcing himself. Employees straightened when they saw him. Some smiled nervously. Others avoided eye contact. The atmosphere felt different from the polished presentations he usually received. It felt human. At the far end of the office, he found Aaliyah Carter. She was answering calls while organizing documents beside her computer. A small picture of her son Jordan was placed carefully near her keyboard. She looked exactly like he remembered. Tired, focused, determined. Damien noticed the worn coffee cup beside her and the stack of unfinished tasks waiting for her. Miss Carter, he said. Aaliyah looked up and froze. She immediately stood. Mr. Whitmore? Her surprise was obvious. She had not expected the CEO of the company to know her name. I need to ask you about your payroll records, Damien said. Her expression changed. Not fear. Concern. Is something wrong? She asked. Damien hesitated. For the first time in his career, he realized he did not know how to speak to someone whose life was affected by his decisions. I found a discrepancy, he said. Aaliyah gave a small, tired smile. A discrepancy is a nice way to describe it. Those words stayed with him. You knew? Damien asked. She looked at the floor for a moment. I knew something was wrong. But people like me learn quickly that asking too many questions can cost us opportunities. Damien felt the weight of that sentence. Why did you not report it? Aaliyah looked back at him. Because I have a son who depends on me. Because rent still has to be paid. Because sometimes surviving today feels more important than fighting tomorrow. Her honesty was quiet, but it carried more power than any presentation he had heard in the boardroom. Before Damien could respond, his assistant called him. The board of directors was waiting. Victoria Hart had requested an emergency meeting. Damien already knew that was not a coincidence. Someone knew he was asking questions. As he walked back toward the executive elevator, he looked once more at Aaliyah sitting at her desk. For years, he had believed leadership meant having all the answers. But that morning, he learned something far more uncomfortable. Sometimes leadership began when you finally admitted you had been asking the wrong questions. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had always been Damien Whitmore's favorite place to think. Surrounded by glass walls and a skyline that reminded him of everything he had built, it was where he made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But that morning, the room felt different. The numbers on the screen were familiar, yet for the first time, they felt incomplete. Victoria Hart sat at the end of the table with calm confidence. She had been with Whitmore Technologies since its earliest days, long before the company became a billion-dollar empire. Many people saw her as the person who protected the company when others were afraid to make difficult choices. Damien, I understand you are concerned, she said, folding her hands neatly. But we need to be careful. One employee situation does not represent the entire organization. Damien looked at the documents in front of him. It is not one employee. It is a question about how many people we failed to notice. A quiet tension filled the room. Victoria did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her confidence came from years of controlling conversations like this. You are looking at a few documents and assuming the worst, she replied. I am looking at a company that grew because people made practical decisions. Damien remembered those words. Practical, efficient, necessary. They were words he had used himself many times. After the meeting, Marcus Bell joined him outside the executive office. She is protecting the system, Marcus said quietly. Damien looked through the glass walls at employees walking below. Or maybe the system is protecting itself. Meanwhile, Aaliyah Carter was back at home preparing dinner for Jordan. Her apartment was small, but every corner carried signs of care. A stack of library books sat beside the couch. Her son's school artwork covered the refrigerator. She had built a life around making sure he felt safe, even when she did not always feel that way herself. When her phone rang, she expected another work message. Instead, it was an unknown number. Hello, she answered carefully. Miss Carter, this is Marcus Bell from Whitmore Technologies. I would like to ask you some questions about your employment history. Aaliyah became quiet. She knew that calls like this could change everything. Am I in trouble? She asked. Marcus paused. No, I am trying to understand something. After the call ended, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table and looked at the two-page stubs she had kept for months. She remembered every late night, every bus ride home, every moment she wondered if speaking up would put her job at risk. She had not kept those papers because she wanted revenge. She kept them because some part of her believed the truth mattered. The next day, Damien reviewed hundreds of employee records. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Small deductions, changed classifications, unpaid additional hours hidden behind complicated policies. None of it looked dramatic on a single report. But together, it told a story about people who had become invisible. Then Marcus found something that changed everything. A confidential internal report from 3 years earlier. It showed that senior leadership had been warned about payroll inconsistencies. The issue had never disappeared. It had simply been buried under better-looking numbers. Damien stared at the report, unable to move. Who signed off on this? He asked. Marcus slowly turned the document around. At the bottom was a signature. Victoria Hart. Damien felt the room become silent. The woman who had spent years teaching him how to protect the company had also been protecting a secret inside it. But before he could act, his assistant entered with a message. The board had scheduled another meeting. Emergency session. No explanation. No discussion. Damien looked at Marcus. He already knew what was happening. Someone was moving before he could. And for the first time in his career, Damien Whitmore realized he was not investigating a problem inside his company. He was standing against the people who had built it. The most dangerous moment for a company is not when it loses money. It is when the people inside stop telling the truth. Damien Whitmore heard those words before, but he never understood their meaning until he walked into the emergency board meeting and realized everyone in the room already knew more than he did. The large screen behind Victoria Hart displayed a carefully prepared presentation. Revenue growth, employee satisfaction numbers, operational efficiency reports. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Victoria stood beside the table with the same calm expression she had worn for years. Damien, before we make emotional decisions, we need to remember what built this company, she said. Discipline, strategy, difficult choices. Damien looked at the screen, then at the folder Marcus had given him. The confidential report sat inside like a weight he could not ignore. Difficult choices should not mean hiding problems from the people responsible for fixing them. The room became quiet. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable looks. Victoria noticed. She always noticed. You are allowing one employee's personal situation to influence your judgment, she replied. Damien felt those words hit differently now. One employee. That was exactly how the company had seen people like Aaliyah Carter. Individual cases. Separate problems. Numbers without names. Her situation is not the problem, Damien said. The problem is that nobody thought it mattered. Across the city, Aaliyah sat in a small clinic waiting room with Jordan beside her. Her son was coloring in a notebook while she checked the time repeatedly. Missing work was always a risk. Every hour away meant another calculation at the end of the month. When her phone received a message from Marcus, she expected bad news. Instead, it was a request for a private meeting. Aaliyah stared at the screen for several seconds. She knew people in powerful positions did not usually look for employees like her unless something had gone wrong. When she arrived at a quiet coffee shop near the company building, Marcus was already waiting. He looked different from the confident executive she had seen at work. He looked tired. I owe you an apology, Marcus said. Aaliyah sat down slowly. For what? For seeing your file and not seeing you. The honesty surprised her. Marcus explained that the investigation had revealed problems affecting many employees, not just her. Aaliyah listened carefully. She wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her to be cautious. I appreciate that you are looking into it, she said. But people like me have heard promises before. Marcus nodded. I know. At the same time, Damien was learning the cost of challenging the system he controlled. Victoria had already started moving behind the scenes. By the afternoon, rumors began spreading among executives that Damien was making decisions based on personal feelings. A few investors questioned whether he was still capable of leading objectively. The story changed quickly. It was no longer about missing payroll records. It was about whether the billionaire CEO had lost control. Damien sat alone in his office that evening, looking at the city lights outside his window. For years, he believed leadership meant protecting the company from uncertainty. Now he wondered if he had been protecting the company from the very people who needed him to listen. His assistant entered quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, Victoria has requested another meeting tomorrow morning." Damien looked up. "What does she want?" The assistant hesitated. "She said she wants to discuss your future with the company." Damien understood immediately. This was no longer an investigation. It was a battle for control. And somewhere in the middle of it was the woman on the last bus, the employee whose name he almost overlooked, who had unknowingly exposed the biggest weakness inside everything he had built. The hardest decisions are never between right and wrong. They are between two things you cannot afford to lose. Damien Whitmore had spent his entire career making decisions under pressure, but nothing prepared him for the choice waiting inside the executive conference room. Victoria Hart sat across from him with a folder placed neatly in front of her. She did not look angry. She looked prepared. That was what made her dangerous. "The board is concerned about your recent actions," Victoria said calmly. "You have allowed one employee complaint to create uncertainty across the entire company." Damien looked at the folder. "One employee," he repeated. Victoria opened it and pushed several documents forward. Inside were reports showing delays, complaints, and financial concerns connected to his investigation. The message was clear. If he continued, the company could suffer. If he stopped, the problems would remain hidden. "You built this company because you understood sacrifice," Victoria said. "Sometimes protecting thousands of employees means making decisions that hurt a few." Damien stared at the documents, feeling the weight of those words. Years ago, he would have agreed. He had believed leadership meant accepting difficult choices others were unwilling to make. But then he remembered Aaliyah sitting at her desk, quietly working while carrying a burden nobody noticed. He remembered her saying that surviving today sometimes felt more important than fighting tomorrow. That sentence had stayed with him. After the meeting, Damien visited the customer support floor again. This time, he did not arrive as a CEO inspecting a department. He arrived as someone searching for answers. He spoke with employees. He listened to stories that never appeared in company reports. A father who skipped medical appointments because of missed hours. A young worker who stopped pursuing school because overtime became necessary. A single mother who kept emergency money hidden in an envelope because she never knew when the next problem would arrive. Every conversation added another piece to a truth he had ignored. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was facing her own difficult choice. Marcus had asked her to provide a formal statement about her experience. It could help expose the problems inside the company, but it could also put her job at risk. She sat at her kitchen table that night, while Jordan finished his homework nearby. The two-page stubs rested beside her. For months, those papers had represented frustration. Now they represented a decision. "Mom, are you okay?" Jordan asked. Aaliyah smiled gently. "I am just trying to decide if doing the right thing is worth being afraid." Her son looked at her and said something simple. "You always tell me not to hide when something is wrong." Those words reminded her of the lesson she had tried to teach him every day. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing what mattered despite fear. The next morning, Aaliyah signed the statement. She did not do it because she trusted the company. She did it because she trusted herself. When Damien received the statement, he read every word carefully. For the first time, he saw the company from the perspective of someone who had never been invited into the room where decisions were made. He called Marcus immediately. "We are going public with the findings." Marcus became silent. "Damien, if you do this, Victoria will move against you." Damien looked around his office, at the awards, the photographs, and the symbols of everything he had achieved. "Then maybe it is time I find out what this company is worth without hiding behind the things I built." Hours later, Victoria entered the boardroom with a final strategy. She had anticipated his move. She had prepared the investors. She had prepared the media. And she had prepared one last argument. If Damien chose the employees over the company, she would make sure everyone believed he was the reason the company failed. For the first time in his life, Damien Whitmore was not fighting to protect his position. He was fighting to prove he deserved it. The moment a leader chooses the truth, he must be ready to lose everything built on a lie. Damien Whitmore learned that lesson the morning his own company turned against him. The announcement had barely reached the public before the headlines began changing the story. They were no longer asking why employees had been affected by unfair payroll practices. They were asking whether Damian Whitmore was still capable of leading a billion-dollar company. The carefully controlled image of a confident CEO began to crack. Victoria Hart moved faster than anyone expected. She released a statement explaining that the company had always followed established procedures and suggested that Damian had acted too quickly without considering the financial consequences. She never accused him directly. She did not need to. The doubt was enough. Inside the company, employees whispered about the future. Investors requested explanations. Board members demanded meetings. And Damian realized the system he had spent years building was now protecting itself from change. At the same time, Aaliyah Carter watched the news from her small apartment while Jordan sat beside her finishing his homework. Her name had appeared in several articles. Not because she wanted attention, but because the two pay stubs she carried had become the beginning of something much larger. She felt uncomfortable seeing strangers discuss her life. She had never wanted to become a symbol. She had only wanted someone to admit that something was wrong. Marcus Bell called her that evening. His voice sounded different. "Aaliyah, I need you to understand something. Victoria is trying to make this look like a personal conflict between you and the company." Aaliyah looked at the papers on her kitchen table. "But it was never just about me." Marcus was quiet. He knew she was right. The following day, Damian faced the board again. This time, the room felt colder. The people who once praised his decisions now questioned his judgment. Victoria placed a report in front of him. "The market is reacting badly," she said. "If this continues, thousands of employees could suffer because of your actions." Damian looked at the report. It was the kind of argument he would have made years earlier. Protect the company first. Protect the numbers. Protect the image. But now he understood something he had never considered before. A company could survive a financial loss. It could recover from a difficult quarter. But when people inside an organization stopped believing they mattered, something much deeper was lost. "You are asking me to protect the company by ignoring the people who built it," Damian said. Victoria remained calm. "I am asking you to be realistic." Damian looked around the room. For years, he had believed being realistic meant accepting difficult truths. Now he wondered if some people used that word to avoid uncomfortable ones. Then came the vote. The board members looked at the documents. They looked at the investors' concerns. They looked at the growing pressure surrounding the company. When the final decision was announced, Damian felt the weight of every word. He was temporarily removed from his position as chief executive officer until the investigation was complete. For the first time since he built the company, Damian walked out of the executive floor without the authority that had defined him. No assistants followed him. No meetings waited for him. No one asked for his decision. Outside the building, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Later that evening, Damian sat alone on a bench near the same bus route where he first met Aaliyah. He looked at the passing buses and thought about the woman who had unknowingly challenged everything he believed about leadership. He had spent years thinking power meant having the ability to change other people's lives. Now he understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest change begins when someone takes away your power and forces you to see what you were never willing to see before. Losing power does not always mean losing everything. Sometimes it is the only way a person finally discovers what truly matters. Damian Whitmore spent his first week away from the company doing something he had never allowed himself to do before. He listened. Without the title of chief executive officer, without the security of a corner office, and without people carefully choosing their words around him, he began seeing the company differently. He visited employees who had worked behind the scenes for years. He heard stories about people who never complained because they believed nobody important would care. Every conversation reminded him of Aaliyah Carter sitting quietly on that last bus, holding two pay stubs that revealed a truth nobody wanted to face. Meanwhile, Aaliyah continued going to work, but everything felt different. Some employees supported her privately. Others avoided her because they were afraid of being connected to the controversy. She understood their fear. Fear was something she had lived with for years. Fear of losing income. Fear of asking questions. Fear of becoming a problem instead of being seen as a person. One afternoon, Marcus Bell met with her outside the company building. "There is something you need to know," he said. "Victoria is preparing another move." Aaliyah looked at him carefully. "What kind of move?" Marcus handed her a document. It was a legal notice challenging the credibility of the employee reports. Victoria was claiming that the payroll differences were misunderstandings caused by outdated systems, not intentional decisions. Aaliyah read the page slowly. She is trying to make everyone believe this was just a mistake. Marcus nodded. And if people believe that, the investigation ends. Aaliyah looked through the window at the employees walking through the lobby. People who were carrying the same worries she had carried. People who had learned to stay quiet because silence felt safer. Then we cannot let the story end here, she said. Those words surprised even her. Months earlier, she would have stepped back. She would have protected her job and focused only on Jordan. But something had changed. She was no longer fighting only for herself. That evening, Damien received a message from Aaliyah. It was short. She wanted to meet. When they sat across from each other at a small neighborhood cafe, neither of them spoke for a moment. The billionaire CEO and the employee who had changed the direction of his life sat at the same table, not as different worlds, but as two people trying to understand the truth. I am sorry, Damien said first. Aaliyah looked surprised. For what? For building a company where people felt invisible. She studied him carefully. Months ago, she would have expected an apology to come with a solution, a check, or an offer. But this time, he offered none of those things. Only honesty. I do not need you to save me, Mr. Whitmore, she said. I need you to make sure nobody else has to feel like they are invisible. Damien nodded slowly. That was the moment he understood the difference between helping someone and changing something. Helping one person could ease pain. Changing something could prevent that pain from happening again. The next morning, Marcus found new evidence. A series of internal messages showed that senior leadership had repeatedly ignored employee concerns because addressing them would affect quarterly profits. The evidence was stronger than anything they had before. But there was one problem. The final decision would be made by the board, and Victoria still controlled the majority of the votes. Damien looked at the documents in his hands. He knew what came next. He could fight to regain his position quietly and protect his future. Or he could reveal everything publicly and risk losing the company permanently. For years, Damien had measured success by what he could keep. His wealth, his influence, his control. But now he faced the one choice he had spent his entire life avoiding. What was he willing to lose to prove he had finally learned how to lead? The moment before a person changes their life is often the moment when they have the most to lose. Damien Whitmore stood outside the headquarters of the company he built and looked up at the glass tower that had represented success for so many years. For most people, that building was a symbol of achievement. For Damien, it had become a question. What was the cost of everything he had built? Inside the boardroom, the final meeting began. Victoria Hart sat confidently among the board members, surrounded by reports and financial projections designed to protect the company's image. She believed the situation was already under control. She believed Damien would choose his legacy over a difficult truth. You still have time to make the responsible decision, Victoria said. Withdraw your accusations. Allow the company to move forward. Damien looked at the people around the table. These were the same people who had trusted him for years. The same people who had celebrated every achievement. But now he understood something. Trust was not built by avoiding uncomfortable conversations. It was built by having them. The responsible decision is not always the comfortable one, Damien replied. Victoria's expression remained calm, but her eyes changed slightly. She knew she was losing control of the conversation. Before Damien could continue, the doors opened. Aaliyah Carter walked into the room with Marcus Bell beside her. The board members looked surprised. She was not supposed to be there. She was not an executive. She did not have a title that gave her a seat at the table. But she carried something more important. The truth. Aaliyah placed a folder in front of the board. Inside were statements from employees across different departments. Not complaints. Not accusations. Stories. Real experiences from people who had spent years feeling invisible. I know what it feels like to believe nobody important is listening, Aaliyah said quietly. But the people who work here are not numbers on a report. They are the reason the company exists. The room became silent. Victoria tried to interrupt. This is an emotional argument, not a business decision. Aaliyah looked at her. That is exactly the problem. We have spent so long separating people from business that we forgot business is made by people. Damien watched her carefully. Months earlier, he would have stepped in. He would have spoken for her. He would have tried to control the outcome. But he did not. He allowed her voice to fill the room because he finally understood that leadership was not about being the loudest person present. It was about creating space for others to be heard. Marcus then presented the internal evidence, the ignored reports, the repeated warnings, the decisions made behind closed doors. One by one, the facts changed the atmosphere in the room. Victoria's strategy began to fall apart. She had expected Damien to be the center of the fight. She had not expected the employees themselves to become the strongest voice against the system. When the board members reviewed the evidence, the final vote was no longer about protecting a reputation. It was about deciding what kind of company they wanted to become. Later that evening, Damien and Aaliyah stood outside the building. The city lights reflected on the windows above them. "You changed everything," Damien said. Aaliyah shook her head. "No, I just stopped believing that being quiet was the same as being powerless." Those words stayed with him. The next morning, the board announced a full company review and removed Victoria Hart from her position as chairwoman while the investigation continued. But the victory came with a cost. Damien was offered the opportunity to return as CEO only if he accepted major changes to his authority and ownership structure. The man who once controlled every decision now had to share power. He agreed without hesitation. Because for the first time in his life, Damien Whitmore understood that losing control did not mean losing everything. Sometimes it meant finally becoming worthy of what you had built. A year later, Damien Whitmore returned to the place where everything had changed. The city was still the same. The streets were still busy. The buses still moved through Chicago carrying people who were tired, hopeful, and trying to build better lives. But Damien was no longer the same person who had stepped onto that bus, carrying only questions and assumptions. He stood near the same bus stop where he had first seen Aaliyah Carter holding 2 worn pay stubs. Back then, he had looked at those papers and seen a problem. Now he saw a person. The changes inside Whitmore Technologies had not happened overnight. They required patience, difficult conversations, and decisions that were not always popular. The company created a new employee support program, improved payroll transparency, and established a direct communication system where workers could share concerns without fear. Some investors left. Some questioned Damien's choices, but others saw something different. They saw a company becoming stronger because it finally understood the people behind the numbers. Aaliyah Carter had also changed. She was no longer the woman who quietly carried every burden alone. She had accepted a leadership position in the company's employee relations division, where she helped create solutions for workers facing challenges similar to hers. She still lived in the same neighborhood. She still packed Jordan's lunch every morning. She still saved money carefully. But now, when she walked through the company building, people knew her name. Not because of a problem she exposed, but because of the difference she helped create. One afternoon, Damien visited the employee center and found Aaliyah reviewing new training materials. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I used to think leadership was about having the right answers." Aaliyah looked up. "And now?" Damien glanced around the room. Employees were talking, sharing ideas, and asking questions without hesitation. "Now I think leadership is about making sure the right people are heard." Aaliyah smiled. She remembered the first time they met. She remembered the tired woman on the last bus who believed she had to carry everything alone. That woman felt like a different person now. But the truth was, she had always been strong. She just needed someone to finally see it. That evening, Damien boarded the same bus route where their lives first crossed. This time, he was not hiding from the world behind a private car. He was sitting among the people who made his company possible. An employee recognized him and smiled. "You take the bus now?" the man asked. Damien looked out the window as the city lights passed by. "Sometimes you have to return to where you learned something important." The bus continued through the city streets, carrying people with different stories, different struggles, and different dreams. Near the back seat, Damien noticed a young worker reviewing a paycheck carefully. For a moment, he remembered the 2 papers that changed everything. 2 simple documents that revealed a truth hidden in plain sight. Years ago, he thought wealth meant never needing anyone. Now he understood something completely different. Wealth was not measured by what you could keep. It was measured by what you were willing to change for others. When the bus reached the final stop, Damien stepped outside and looked back one more time. The same place that once revealed a broken system had become the beginning of a better one. And somewhere in that quiet moment, he remembered the lesson Aaliyah had taught him. The people who are easiest to overlook are often the ones who show us what truly matters. Because sometimes the person waiting in the back of the room, the person sitting quietly on the last bus, is the person who reminds the world how to become human again.